Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to Dukakis Online at ACT, the American College of Thessaloniki. I'm David Wisner, Executive Director of the Dukakis Center and Professor of International Relations at ACT. On behalf of my colleagues in the faculty, the staff, and the senior administration of ACT and Anatolia College, I'd like to wish everyone a belated Happy New Year, all the best for 2021. Before I introduce our speaker, the Honorable John Sarbanes, Congressman from Maryland, I'd like to just remind our audience briefly what the mission of the Dukakis Center is. We celebrated our 20th anniversary last year. The center was inaugurated in 1999 in honor of former governor of Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis. Our mission is very straightforward: to inspire and empower young people to take an active interest and active roles in public affairs in their community, in their city, in their country, as diplomats working on the international stage. It's an ethos which is shared by our speaker and our speaker's late father, Senator Paul Sarbanes. So it's quite appropriate that we welcome our speaker this evening to tell us a little bit about what's happening in American politics today and what he expects is going to take place going forth. John Sarbanes, as we've said, is a congressman representing the 3rd District of Maryland, just recently re-elected to serve an 8th term in the House of Representatives. He will be speaking to us today live from his office at the Capitol, if I'm not mistaken. And it's really quite a distinct honor to have him with us today. So Congressman Sarbanes, it's been a rather unique and unprecedented electoral season in the United States. I would like to ask you just briefly for your general impressions, bearing in mind that we're looking on with considerable concern from Greece. We have an audience which is international, and we are really keen to know what is happening and what to expect going forth. So again, welcome to the Dukakis Center, and I'm just keen to hear what you have to say on the subject.
Well, thank you very much, David. It's an honor to join with you and with your audience this evening to discuss these very important topics. I want to congratulate the Michael and Kitty Dukakis Center for its wonderful work, and of course, pay tribute to Michael and Kitty themselves. I had the opportunity to speak with Governor Dukakis not too long ago. He is well and remains very active in issues of the day. And of course, he's a leading light within the Greek American community, having been the Democratic nominee for president in 1988. And of course, governor of Massachusetts for a number of years. And he continues to teach to this day. So it's a pleasure to be with you. I'm also joining you today, and I'm actually not in my Capitol office. I'm headed to the Capitol later today. I'm in my sort of Zoom studio in my home, as we've all become used to doing. But I'm joining you today on the anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, which we celebrate in the United States every year. It is a federal holiday. It's very important, I think, particularly at this moment, to lift up Dr. King and his legacy. He stood for nonviolence. He stood for the power of peaceful protest. I think that's something we want to keep very much in mind, given what we've seen over the last 10 days. And he showed that you can achieve powerful change through those kinds of means and those kinds of tactics. I will mention, because we have a Greek American audience that's participating in this call and an international Greek diaspora audience, as well as Greeks in Greece, that there is a powerful connection to Dr. King. In 1965, when he marched for voting rights in Selma, Alabama, he called on clergy from all across the country to join him. And one of those who did it was Archbishop Jacobus, who was then the Archbishop of North and South America, who answered that call and came to Selma and marched with Dr. King. And that was a high point, I think, in the relationship that continues to this day between the African-American community in the United States and the Greek-American community. I think it's important just to emphasize that today. You referenced, obviously, how momentous this recent election was, all the challenges that it presented. I think if I were to characterize in shorthand what was achieved in the November election, it was that the American people pulled our democracy back from the brink. It was really hanging over the precipice. But the reality is that the democracy we pulled back is still quite fragile and needs real attention and nurturing to get back to full strength. And I've been privileged over the last few years to be at the center of our efforts in Washington to assemble a broad set of reforms that can respond to these challenges we're experiencing in our democracy and try to make American democracy as strong and resilient as it can possibly be. As author of H.R. 1, the For the People Act, that's been my principal focus over the last few years, and I think we have an opportunity to move that forward. I do have to acknowledge the shock that people around the world felt on January 6th when they saw the Capitol, the United States Capitol, being attacked by armed protesters and rioters. I know the imagery of that was something very destabilizing to people who see the US Capitol as a symbol of freedom and democracy. As jarring as that was, I think the most powerful moment in that day, David, was when members of Congress reassembled in the House chamber and finished the important task of counting the certified electoral results from around the country and making it clear that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris would be the next president and vice president of the United States. We finished that task at 4 o'clock in the morning on January 7th. But in so doing, we showed our determination to make sure that American democracy is strong and robust. And that's how we're going to continue to move forward in this difficult moment. It's important for the United States. I think it's important for the leadership of the United States around the globe.
Yeah, this is great. And I'm happy that you're focusing on the constructive moments in this particular drama. We're going to see the next president, vice president inaugurated in 2 days' time. The political dynamics are really, really interesting if you're a student of politics, as you were at one point in time. And now that you are a practitioner, it has to be even more challenging. But let's say, what do you anticipate the incoming Biden administration is going to prioritize? And what sorts of accomplishments do you think that they will manage to get through? I mean, what would be your expectation as a congressperson in the party that has a majority of seats in the House of Representatives?
David, I think the most obvious priority for the new president and vice president, and you've already seen this articulated, is to address this terrible pandemic that we're experiencing, obviously not just in the United States, but people around the world are experiencing. We've felt, members of the Democratic Party for sure, and I think to be honest, a lot of members of the Republican Party, that the response that President Trump had to the pandemic was simply not up to the task. And as a result, we've lost a lot of time and we've lost a lot of lives. The new incoming President Biden has a plan to coordinate the response and attack on the virus that we need at all levels, and also to provide significant economic relief to those that are under stress. So that's going to be the number one priority, as it should be. But I think there are other things that need attention. We know that America, particularly over the last year, has experienced incidents of racial violence, which have pointed to the continuing ingrained bias that we have within many of our law enforcement organizations, racial bias. That needs attention. The death of George Floyd really galvanized this, but there are so many other families who grieve in America for similar losses. And we need as a country to address this head on and be clear-eyed about what needs to happen to make real change there. And I think the new president and vice president are very committed to that. I also think that democracy reform is critical, because one of the reasons, to be honest, that we see such division in the country is because there's a corrosive cynicism that has infected many Americans. When they look at their government, they feel that it doesn't listen carefully enough to their voices. And when you become cynical and then frustrated and then angry, you can reach for destructive solutions. And I think in some ways, the last president, President Trump, kind of exploited that sentiment in negative ways. But you can also appeal to people's better angels and say there's a way to fix our democracy and address your cynicism by restoring your voice, making your democratic institutions work well rather than tearing them down. Okay. And if you look at the reforms that we've put together, David, in the For the People Act, it would expand voting in America to make it easier for people to get to the ballot box. It would address this system of drawing congressional district lines, which creates a lot of cynicism among the public. It's sort of a complicated topic, but it's important. It would create more transparency and ethical accountability on the part of those who serve in government, which is really, really important if you're going to have the faith and trust of the people. And this is also critical, people in America, like others around the world, but certainly in our society, feel that big money and special interests have too much influence. And oftentimes, when it comes to making public policy, they're the ones that call the shots. And that policy is not made on behalf of the broad public interest. So we have to do things to push back on that influence and lift up the voices of everyday Americans so that they feel that the government really answers to them and belongs to them. All of these reforms are critical to address that cynicism. And my view has always been that the stronger our democracy is, in terms of Americans having confidence in it, the stronger it is in terms of resisting attack from the outside. And we've certainly seen with Russian interference in the 2016 election and others, that it can be easy to sow discord in American society if Americans themselves don't have faith in our democracy. So it's so important to do this, to make people feel counted. I will tell you that as someone of Greek heritage, I feel a kind of special calling here to protect democracy, because to me, it honors the legacy of my ancestors. Greeks are very proud of the idea that we invented democracy. I think we have a special responsibility to nurture and protect it. And so that's one of the roles that I hope to fulfill.
That's great. I'd like to press you a little bit more on that, but allow me to make two very brief announcements. The Dukakis Center is a rigorously nonpartisan forum for young people. We don't hide the fact that Michael Dukakis was a proud, lifelong Democrat. But we don't seek to influence the opinions and the orientations of the young people. But I do feel some need to acknowledge the presence of some of my friends and colleagues. In Athens particularly, there's a contingent of members of Democrats abroad, Greece, watching your comments this afternoon, Congressman Sarbanes. You mentioned reform. You're involved in a rather unique and inspiring grassroots reform effort to modify or to eliminate the role that big money plays in American politics. It's something that we see from the outside, and sometimes it would lead us to disparage the integrity of the American political system. Can you tell us a little bit about that particular project that you're involved in, and what likelihood we'll see some movement on this particular issue of money in politics in the coming years?
Yeah, I'd love to. And just to pick up on your other comment, one of the things about these reform efforts that we've seen, which is very gratifying to me, is if you look at all the core elements that we've put into the For the People Act, which is this reform package, they are supported across the political spectrum. So when you talk to Republicans, Democrats, and independents, they want to see these changes. So in that sense, this reform package is quite nonpartisan or bipartisan, if you want to put it that way. And I think shows great promise for how we can begin to heal the divisions in our country if we can get these reforms in place. Now, to speak to the money reforms, right now the harsh reality is that in order to be successful in national politics, you have to raise a tremendous amount of money for your campaigns. The average cost of a 2-year campaign for the House of Representatives now is close to $2 million. So you have to raise $2 million to run an effective competitive campaign. Unfortunately, the only place you can find that kind of money is to go to places and people who've got deep pockets. And those tend to be, big corporations, deep-pocketed political donors who have an agenda of their own. And so if a lot of the money for your campaign is coming from those sources, it's a natural human tendency to then lean in the direction of those interests when it comes time to make public policy. That's just human nature. But it distorts how policy gets made. And so oftentimes it's the priorities of the privileged few who are bankrolling campaigns who get the most attention. And the things that would impact everyday Americans who have less means don't get that attention. So one thing we wanted to set up inside of this reform was a system where small donors giving $25 or $50 could earn matching funds on a 6-to-1 basis when they contribute to candidates who agree to abide by certain rules, to not take PAC money and big dollars. And in that way, you encourage candidates to reach out to smaller donors because they can earn this matching fund and spend more time listening to those constituents, to those voters, instead of spending their time with the inside crowd and the sort of money people. If we could put a system like that in place, I think you would see many candidates who run for Congress would turn towards the people. They would spend more time listening to average Americans and paying attention to their priorities because they would understand that that's the group that can power them in their campaigns. So it's all about incentives. You know this.
Yep.
In politics, it's all about how you respond to incentives. We want to give candidates and members of Congress incentives to spend time with the people out there in their district who represent the broad public interest. instead of spending time behind closed doors with big donors and corporate interests who have the capacity to spread a lot of money around. It would be a very fundamental change. And we've seen it at the state and local level, David. These systems work. We just think it's time to bring it to Washington.
Okay, and I suppose you have to start somewhere and, just keep pressing, making the case. Let me allow our people who are watching online. We have a sizable number of people watching on Zoom and an equally large number of people, if not more, watching on Facebook. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the QA function on the Zoom platform, and I'll field as many of the questions as I can. On the topic of reform, Congressman, what about some of the larger issues? Every 4 years, it seems, we have critics of the Electoral College bemoaning this relic of a bygone era. I mean, is it something that you feel needs attention? Is there any likelihood that the means by which we actually conduct an election for federal office, is there any likelihood that the presidential election is going to change in the near future, in our lifetimes?
Well, the Electoral College is, as you know, a pretty controversial topic, and we have seen a number of elections in the recent past where the Electoral College went in one direction and the popular vote went in another direction. And when that happens, of course, it creates a lot of, sort of tension and discussion around whether this is an obsolete and outmoded way of electing presidents in this country. And as you know, the way it works is each state gets to determine how its votes are allocated for purposes of the Electoral College. Typically, they determine that based on the popular vote within their state, and then they attribute all of the electoral votes to the candidate who wins the popular vote in the state. But you can have a situation where nationally, one candidate gets more electoral votes, but the other candidate gets more popular votes. So there's much discussion about whether to reform this. As a practical matter, it would require a change to the Constitution. That's a difficult process because you have to get 2/3 of House members and 2/3 of Senate members to approve a constitutional amendment. And then you have to get 3/4 of all the state legislatures to do the same. So it's an arduous process. There is something underway which is a kind of campaign to persuade states to attribute or allocate their electoral votes not on the basis of who wins their state, but on the basis of who wins the national popular vote. Okay. And if you got enough states to join in that effort, you could get to a point where the national vote would then determine the Electoral College. Unfortunately, I think as a political matter, that's going to be a heavy lift too, because I don't see all the states that you would need agreeing to that to get to the kind of 270 person threshold. Right. So this is all to say that while I think the Electoral College is going to continue to get study and that it's an important reform to think about, for now, the Electoral College is going to continue to be the way we elect our president in this country. And I think, therefore, it's important that any candidate who runs for president be sensitized to the concerns across the different states in our country. And I think what's happened over the last few elections is there are certain states where some of the economic challenges have been particularly acute. And that has driven people's political perspective, as well as the view that Washington isn't listening anymore to certain parts of our country or certain states or certain populations. This gets back to the reform issue, because if you could convince people across the country that Washington is more accountable to them, then you might get a more shared perspective when it comes time to go cast the vote. So everything is connected in this conversation. And I think the basic reforms that we want to see through the For the People Act, if we could get those implemented, it would actually begin restoring confidence and trust across the country. And I have a sense that that would lead to more alignment between the results of the Electoral College vote and the results of the national popular vote.
Okay, so they would mirror one another a little bit more closely.
Exactly.
I think I perhaps neglected to mention this on the outset. You are a Fulbright alumnus. You spent a year in Greece after finishing your college education. We have the current director Fulbright Greece, Artemis Zanetou, online, and she extends her greetings and expresses the pride she has of your being a Fulbright alumnus. I'm receiving one question from a viewer here asking how vulnerable the United States is currently to domestic threats or to threats from without. It's a foreign policy question. This is not necessarily your area of expertise currently in the Congress, but it's a question I think that all Americans should be asking.
Well, first of all, let me say to Artemis, I want to thank her for her leadership of the Fulbright program in Greece, which is one of the proudest Fulbright programs around the world. It's one of the longest in existence, and I was certainly honored to be a Fulbright scholar and to spend a year in Greece. One of the best years of my life, I would say, back in 1984. So I want to thank her, and also for the condolences she sent recently about the passing of my father. Certainly, we need to be vigilant about threats coming against the United States from outside, and particularly one has to be focused on this during the transfer of power that occurs. We are moving from obviously one 4-year administration to a new 4-year administration. There's a lot of turnover of personnel. And unfortunately, as we've seen, because this president refused to accept the results of the election and concede the election after it was concluded in November, there's been a lot of difficulty in this handoff that you would like to see from one administration to the next. The hallmark of this, the best example of a smooth and cooperative transition was between the George W. Bush administration and that of Barack Obama. It's important that, particularly when it comes to national security issues and issues of defense, that you have that cooperative transition. Because we have not had that in this instance, that has raised some concerns about whether we're more exposed in this moment. Now, shortly, within the next 2 days, we'll have a new president taking over. He will have access to all of the intelligence and security components of our government. And I think that notwithstanding some of the difficulties we've seen with this transition, America does remain resilient to attacks from the outside. But I want to go back to what I said a moment ago, which is ultimately the strength of our country and our democracy depends on our own citizens having confidence in the way our democracy operates, because cynicism creates vulnerability to outside forces that want to sow discord. And we've certainly seen that over the last few years. So if we can strengthen our democracy, then we become more resilient to attacks from the outside. I also think that, frankly, who occupies the White House is so critical to our participation in international efforts and alliances that our strength there can be affected by who is president. And I think Joe Biden, we know, is someone who has strong relationships around the globe. He's a statesman over many years of experience as vice president, before that in the United States Senate.
Mhm.
He's built these relationships, and I think that puts the United States in a very good place as we move forward.
Yes, that's something we heard from a panel of foreign policy experts a couple of weeks ago. Even to someone on the right of the political spectrum was rather optimistic about the prospect of a serious and constructive foreign policy being directed by someone with so much past experience. Let's turn now to another reformer, and this would be your late father. I watched the remarks that you made on the floor of the House of Representatives, and I found it really quite moving. It has to be a unique and maybe sad experience. Your father's family came from Laconia. He never hid his Greek roots and was rather proud of them. He had an extremely successful and productive career, both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. And I think my colleague Thodoros Papanestros has a screenshot of your delivering those remarks on the floor of the House of Representatives. Your father was a bit of a reformer also. You had some really pithy remarks in your speech. You said, "I'm for the little guy." Here was a man who was really a different sort of politician. What would you like to say to your audience here in Greece about the late Paul Sarbanes?
Well, thank you, David. I appreciate the opportunity to speak about my father. Going back to the first thing you said, which was that he was very proud of his Greek roots, where he came from. He kept that very close to his heart, and he was never shy about sharing how important his Greek heritage was to him and his understanding of the promise of America. There's a wonderful story that he tells. My father was not someone who typically would take on the press because he understood that they have barrels of ink, and if you get into a contest with them, you can often lose that. So he didn't generally respond to things that would be published with letters to the editor and so forth. But on one occasion, he couldn't help himself. There was an article written. It was an editorial piece by the editors of the Baltimore Sun. And this was when my father was first getting started in politics.
Okay.
And they were talking about his Ivy League education. And they said, he attended Princeton as an undergrad, Harvard Law School. He was a Rhodes Scholar and attended Oxford. He went to one of the best law firms in Baltimore. And through all these things, he's managed to overcome his Greek roots. And my father was so angry at that. He wrote a letter and he said, "I've never thought of my Greek roots and my Greek heritage as something I should have to overcome. By contrast, it's what has motivated me and helped me to reach this advancement and to succeed in life." So he was deeply proud of his Greek heritage. He also understood, because his parents were first generation immigrants into this country.
Right.
He understood the struggle to make a life, to leave, in this instance, a hardscrabble existence in the mountains of southern Greece in Laconia, and to come to the United States to try to achieve the American dream. And he saw how hard they worked, the premium they placed on education, on family, on community, and the difference it made in his own life, giving him the opportunity with a scholarship to attend Princeton University.
Right.
And I think that was so formative to him. His worldview as a result of that was, if I've had these wonderful opportunities, I have to do everything I can to make sure those opportunities are available to others.
Right.
So he never forgot where he came from. He understood deeply what the American dream means. I mean, his father and mother had a small restaurant, the Mayflower Grill, on the eastern shore of Maryland, which is a rural part of Maryland.
Been there.
And he grew up living over the restaurant, working in the restaurant, and he saw what the American dream was all about, and he benefited from that, and he just wanted to make sure others had the same opportunity. That was his motivation. As I said in my floor statement, from the moment he got up in the morning till the moment he went to sleep at night, he fought for the little guy.
Yeah.
He fought for those who just want a chance to make it and are willing to play by the rules and work hard to advance themselves. And I think when he saw others struggling, he saw the story of his own family there, and he wanted to make sure he did everything he could to help people reach the next rung on the ladder. So I can tell you that within 24 hours, the reach of my father's life became crystal clear to me, because I got an email from the person who had been his plumber in his house, telling me how wonderful my father was and how gracious he'd been in all his interactions. Yeah. And in that same 24-hour period, I got a call from President-elect Joe Biden talking about his relationship with my father. So he really connected with people across, whatever spectrum that you would conceive of. And I think that's why he was effective as not just a legislator, but as a public servant.
The story goes that he was not a person to bang his own drum, to try to call attention to his accomplishments. If he could give credit to someone else and thereby get something done, that would be a preferable course of action. It's quite a remarkable personage when you think about all of the massive egos you must encounter on both sides of the Capitol building.
He let his work speak for itself. He understood that if you share credit, it's easier to get things done. Yeah. Because if you don't, as you say, those egos can get in the way, and you can end up losing an opportunity to make real change as a result of that. He was deeply committed to the basic principles of American democracy. He got that from his father, who was self-taught, right. Read the New York Times every day. My grandfather did, snatching moments between the busyness of the restaurant. But my grandfather passed on that deep appreciation to my father. And the other thing is, my father had an integrity that I think was so well respected. People had confidence that whatever position he took on an issue, even if it was something that was a different position or an opposing view, that he got there carefully and thoughtfully and with integrity. And as a result, I think people respected him on both sides of the political spectrum. And that was also helpful in terms of his success as a legislator. So it's quite a legacy, and it's one that I've been privileged to do my best to carry forward. And I think, as you said initially, my father was very much a reformer himself. If you look at his political career, he took on some of the established interests in Baltimore and Maryland, and successfully pushed forward reforms. He's known for the Sarbanes-Oxley bill, which reforms how public companies are supposed to report and make sure that they are acting with integrity. And so he was very much a reformer, and in my own way, I'm trying to emulate that and do what I can to reform what I see as broken right now in American democracy.
Well, you and your father have also been fervent supporters of our operations here at Anatolia College. We have a letter which I found in our archives not too long ago, which Senator Sarbanes sent to Michael Dukakis shortly after the announcement that we would be launching a chair in public policy and service. And I think this testifies to the friendship which must have existed between Michael Dukakis and Senator Sarbanes. They were almost direct contemporaries. I'd like to mention also, for the benefit of the audience here, that you were instrumental in helping us at Anatolia College launch a program in a time of crisis, which would educate talented young people at all levels of the educational spectrum, a program for talented youth directed out of Johns Hopkins University, which I believe falls within your congressional district there in Maryland. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about, again, the importance of education, but I'd like to frame this in terms of civic education, because I think your father and Governor Dukakis share this public service ethos, of which you speak from time to time in your public pronouncements. Where does it come from? How do we bring it to the next generation, which we hope to be able to do here at the Dukakis Center? How do you get this public service ethos? Is it inheritance from your family? Is it part of your Greek roots? Is there something else there that you would be able to share with us this evening?
Well, let me just first, speaking about Governor Dukakis again for a moment. He and my father were actually complete contemporaries in the sense that they both graduated from the Harvard Law School class of 1960. They were both in that class. There was another Greek American, Paul Sarbanes, who lives in Massachusetts, very close to my father and Michael Dukakis. But they knew each other back when they were in law school, and they became fast friends and helped support each other in their political careers going forward. Mm-hmm. And I think Governor Dukakis was a real example to my father as well of kind of how you serve with integrity and intellect and commitment. And so certainly growing up, I had a deep appreciation of the impact that Governor Dukakis had, not just within the Greek American community, but more broadly on American society. I think this concept of civic engagement is so important, David, because sometimes, people can look at the opportunity to serve the broad public interest as residing most closely with those who run for elected office, for example. Right. But the fact of the matter is that whether you actually serve in the public sector or whether you're a private citizen and you serve in the private sector, your opportunities to promote civic engagement are myriad. I mean, there's so many ways to make a difference in your community through volunteerism, by serving on the boards of organizations that are making a difference. And I very much think that is a value that you can trace back to Hellenism. I mean, this idea that you have to be engaged more broadly in your society. My father would very often cite the fact that the Greek word, the origins of the word idiot are idiotis, which means somebody who only cares about their own private situation and doesn't have a broader engagement with the community around them. Mm-hmm. And that's why he endorsed this idea of doing whatever you can to be civically engaged, because that's what builds the connective tissue that can make a society and a civilization as strong as it can possibly be. A few years ago, I started an initiative which we called Hellenism in the Public Service.
Right.
And it was this idea that Greek Americans, because of what I believe to be a special understanding of why civic engagement is so critical, should be looking for ways all the time to give back to the broader community, not just to our own community, but much more broadly than that. And what we did was we tried to lift up examples of where Greek Americans, acting on that instinct and that impulse, were trying to improve the lives of the broader community. That could be raising money for a local hospital's cancer ward. That could be doing a stream cleanup with an environmental group in your district. Whatever it is, if it's lifting up the interests of the broader public, it's making a difference. And I think it's an extension of this concept of philotimo, this idea that you have to stand up and take responsibility, not just for your own life, but for the life of your community. And those are ideals that obviously my father and Governor Dukakis emulated and demonstrated to others. And I encourage young people in particular at this moment in our history where it's so easy to turn inward, particularly technology gives us the opportunity to act anonymously with one another. Find real opportunities to volunteer, to be civically engaged, to do things for other people, because ultimately that will lift all of us up. And frankly, it helps realize one's own personal potential if you are broadly engaged in that way. So it's an absolute value. And I like to think it's something that Greeks have a kind of special relationship and commitment to.
Okay, that's really great. And you couldn't have given a better plug to the Dukakis Center than with those words. I'm going to acknowledge the presence in the audience of one of the trustees of Anatolia College, David Weil. We have the president of Anatolia College here also, Panayotis Vlachos, a couple of the vice presidents, my immediate boss, Stamos Karamouzis, the provost of Anatolia, of ACT, excuse me. In the audience also is a very dear friend from our days in Cleveland, Jennifer Niles, who's currently the director of the American School of Classical Studies. So you have some name recognition and people are turning out to hear what you had to say. It's been most inspiring to me personally. If now you would turn your attention to the young people in the audience who are listening to you. Part of the way in which we try to do our work is to have the young people have a direct encounter with someone in the public service like yourself. What are they to do in their studies? What advice can you give the young people who are struggling with their classes? They're taking seminars on Zoom, and more often than not these days. They're looking at the state of the global economy and wondering if there are jobs to be had anywhere. Is there a piece of advice you can give to a young person who's struggling to get to the end of their education and thinking about what they might do in life once they've finished?
Well, first, let me just go back and say thank you to the leadership of Anatolia that you just cited. I want to congratulate not just you, David, for your leadership there of the Michael and Kitty Dukakis Center, but to the board, to the faculty, to the leadership of the college for really an amazing assembly of educational resources that you've pulled together. I mean, you're sort of covering all dimensions right now, and it's making a huge difference. And frankly, it was one of the reasons I was so confident about encouraging Johns Hopkins University to reach out and build this partnership with the Center for Talented Youth with Anatolia. because I felt if you bring two institutions together, and obviously the Niarchos Foundation helped to resource this opportunity, but if you bring people who've got a real track record of accomplishment together, you can do wonderful things, and that comes from the leadership there.
Okay.
Look, it's very tough for young people right now. It's tough generally because the world's a complicated place.
Yeah.
And now you lay on top of it the pandemic, which has pulled people apart. They're not able to be with each other in most instances or in a lot of places now because of the precautions that are in place. So we do a lot of our communicating virtually, and that can be very difficult. I think the challenges we face broadly around the globe are putting stress and pressure into the lives of young people, and certainly the existential challenge posed by climate change, I think, is at the top of that list. But what I would say to young people is you should take strength from the fact that your instincts to lead are very much appreciated. I think that people are understanding that young people naturally are leaning into the great challenges we face as a world and are being creative and innovative in their thinking about how we can address those challenges. And while other generations have a responsibility, I think that the inspiration for what we need to do broadly to meet these challenges can come from the ideas and the creativity and the motivation and inspiration of the next generation, which are the people that you are helping to provide educational opportunity for. I have to tell you, I'm very much involved in environmental policy, in volunteerism, in the work that I do in the United States in sort of clean energy initiatives and other kinds of things.
Okay.
And it's amazing what you see the next generation coming up with in terms of their ideas and their innovations in this space. So the other thing I would say to young people is figure out what your passion is,
yep,
and then just follow that wherever it leads you. And, you know, on the one hand, you want to try to be as diversified in your education as you possibly can. But there's something that motivates you. There's something that you care deeply about. And if you run towards that, if you embrace that, it will create the opportunities for you going forward. And so I know it's a difficult time to be a young person anywhere in the world, and Greece is no exception. But I think that there are brighter days ahead, because I think largely because of the next generation calling attention to these challenges, we're beginning to get mobilized around them. On Wednesday, I believe as one of his first acts, certainly it's going to happen this week,
okay,
Joe Biden is going to sign an executive order that will have the United States rejoin the Paris Climate Accords.
mm-hmm,
And what I can say is largely because of young people around the globe and in our country, in the United States, even though we haven't had that official partnership in place for the last 4 years, it hasn't stopped communities moving forward in their commitment to address climate change. And now we're going to have a key partner in that effort return to the table, return to the leadership table and be part of that effort. And I give a lot of credit to young people for keeping that issue front and center. So follow your passion, find ways to volunteer in your community, to be civically engaged, and know that I think we're going to be getting to the other side of this pandemic in 2021. That is the hope. And with that can come the opportunity for us to be back together again in physical space with all of the opportunity that presents.
Yeah, that's great. That's so encouraging, because young people are going to be our future, aren't they? And if they take some passionate stance about issues like the environment, then that would lead the rest of us to be a little more hopeful. I'm going to ask you one last question, knowing that you're quite pressed for time. This came a few moments ago. Somebody was asking about the prospects of Kamala Harris as vice president. And I have to say that she is quite an inspiring figure for me personally, and has to do less with her personal ideological or partisan orientation than just with the family story and the things that she went through to get to where she is. Would you have a word to say about how she's likely to manage as the next vice president of the United States?
I think she's going to be terrific. I think that she's got all the skills that you want in a vice president. But I think, as you mentioned, David, the story of her life is, again, the story of the American dream. And it shows that anything is possible in America. I know that Eleni Sakopoulos, who's a lieutenant governor of California, is very close to Kamala Harris, and she's spoken just about her personal integrity and her drive and motivation to make change. So I think it's just a wonderful, amazing thing. Our first woman vice president, our first African-American woman vice president, our first Asian American woman vice president. I mean, it's quite uplifting, and it says something about America's promise. So I'm looking forward to the role that she's going to play in this administration. But I also know that the inspiration that she gives, we saw this through the campaign to so many people out there, not just in our own country, but across the globe, as to what is possible, is amazing. And I think, she's going to be a real partner for Joe Biden in making the kind of change that we want to see.
Great. Well, we'll sign off with that. That's such a fabulous way to end this this little conversation, Congressman Sarbanes. I'll just allow you to know that the Consul General of Thessaloniki has been watching also. She was very discreet about the comments she made, and she thanks you for speaking to all of us here in Thessaloniki this evening. We wish you Godspeed and all the best. Good luck in the next session of Congress, and good luck going forth. Thank you once again. Thank you to all of those in the audience who stuck with us to the very end. We will look forward to seeing you later this semester with the next live event from the Dukakis Center. Once again, I'm David Wisner for the Dukakis Center. Good night, everyone.